Okay, chapter 11 is going to start us off with talking about types of variation. So when you think of the word variation, okay, variation means how things are changing, right? So in math, there are going to be 4 different kinds of variations we're going to talk about today. The first one is called direct variation. Direct variation. Direct variation, you want to think of the word multiply. Think of the word multiply. Because in a direct variation types of equations can be written in the form y equals k times x. K times x. With k being some constant that never changes on how you get from your x to your y. So if I take my x and multiply it by some value every single time, I can get my y value. That is a direct variation. So direct variation, think multiply. And again, that only works for non-zero constants, for non-zero k. Another type of variation would be inverse variation. Inverse variation. If something varies inversely between x and y, that means a fraction. Okay, so think divide. So with direct, you think multiply. Inverse, we're going to think divide. So that means that instead of writing it as y equals kx, we're going to be able to take k and divide it by x to get to my y. So inverse, think divide. And again, it's always for non-zero k. So think fraction. So think fraction. Okay, sometimes we may have another type of variation called a joint variation. Well, joint variation, think about if something varies jointly with something else. That means you have more than one thing going on. So joint variation is a relation. So it is a relation where one variable varies directly with respect to each of 2 or more. With each of 2 or more variables. So what is its basic equation going to look like? That means if that means that we could have some constant k, but we're also multiplying x times y times k in order to get our z value. So basic form of joint variation is z equals k times xy. Reminder, varies directly. Directly, keyword means multiply. And the last type of variation we're going to talk about, or that we could have, is called combined variation. Combined variation is when a relation where one variable varies with respect to each of two or more variables. Okay, so that means we don't just like with joint we just have multiply. Combined, we're going to have multiplication and division. We're going to have multiplication and division. So its basic form will look of the nature z equals k x divided by, let's say, we could have xy divided by w. Okay, so you got two things going on in that one. Okay, so 4 types of variation. We're going to practice setting up equations for direct, think multiply, inverse, think divide. Joint is multiply by 2 or more, and combine, just as it sounds, is multiply and divide. So let's practice changing mathematical sentences into mathematical equations. So how would we rewrite this into a mathematical equation? If z varies jointly with x and y. Z varies jointly with x and y. So let's break it down sentence by sentence. So z varies, so that means z equals jointly. So what do we think of when we think of the word jointly? Jointly, we think of multiply. So we're going to have some constant k that we are multiplying with x and y. And that's our mathematical sentence. So let's try another one. What if we have z varies screen keeps wanting to move. Z varies jointly with x and y. I can't spell and right. Let me fix that. And y, and inversely with w. Okay, so let's break it down sentence by sentence. Z varies, so that's always z equals. Jointly, what do we think of when we think of the word jointly? We think of multiply. So always do your constant k, some constant k that doesn't change, jointly with x and y, so k, x, y. And inversely with w, well, inversely means divide with w. So z equals k, x, y divided by w. Let's try another one. What if z varies directly with x and inversely with the product wy? Well, again, let's break this down step by step. If we start with z varies, so z equals directly. What do we think of when we think of the word directly? Think multiply. So we have k directly with x, so kx. And inversely, what do we think of when we think of inversely? I think fraction, so divide. Inversely means divide So divide with the product of wy. So what does wy mean? Product means multiply. So z equals kx divided by wy. So let's try a different type of problem. Let's take it up a notch now. And we'll notice, what if we actually need to find that k constant of variation problem? So let's look at this example. This time we're going to find the constant of variation. How is my x changing with my y? By what constant? We're going to find that constant. So find the constant of variation k. And then for each inverse variation. So these are going to be inverse functions. So let me move this down a little. I did that a little too high. So find the constant of variation k for each inverse variation. So if I have the point here, 2, 1, and I need to see, okay, what constant, how am I getting from my x to my y if this represents an inverse variation, okay? Well, this represents x, this represents y, and I know from inverse that I have this basic equation, y equals k over x, because that's just from definition of an inverse variation. So my goal is to find this k. Well, let's plug in what I know. I have an x and I have a y. So let's plug in the x and plug in the y. Well, what's y? Y is 1. I don't know what k is, but I know that x is 2. Well, how do we find k? This is just a linear equation now. So to isolate the k, I need to get the 2 out of the denominator. That means I need to multiply both sides by 2. So here, k equals 2. How can I verify this? If I plug it in to my inverse variation, 2, my k value is 2 divided by 2, do I get 1? Yes, I do. So let's try another one of this nature. What if this time we have the point 2/3, 2/3? Don't freak out, fractions are your friends. Okay, we can do this one. We'll do it together. So first off, we know that we have an inverse variation, right? So again, same thing. I know that my y equals some value that I'm looking for divided by x. And what do I have within this scenario? I have an x and a y. So let's plug in our x and our y. Well, my y value is 2/3. And my x value is 2/3. So how do we isolate the k to find that constant of variation? We're simply going to multiply both sides by 2/3. So how do we multiply fractions? Top times top, bottom times bottom. So 2 times 2 is 4. 3 times 3 is 9. And can I simplify? Nope. So we're done. Again, how can we verify? We could plug in 4 over 9 divided by 2/3 will indeed get us 2/3. If you change the division to multiplication, flip, and then multiply tops times tops. So not too bad. Okay, inverse, reminder, inverse, think, divide. Let's do one more, because these can kind of be written in a variety of different ways. So last one, how would we go about solving this type of problem? So suppose x and y vary inversely and x equals 4 when y equals 12. What is y when x equals 10? So suppose x and y vary inversely and x equals 4 when y equals 12. What is y when x equals 10? So let's look at that first sentence. Suppose x and y vary inversely. Well, if x and y vary inversely, inversely means we can divide, right? Let me reread that. That does not look like the word divide, does it? Sorry, my pen is not the best here. So divide. Okay, so suppose x and y vary inversely, so we know for sure that y equals some k value over x. And we also know that when x equals 4, y equals 12. So let's plug in that. So when x equals 4, y equals 12. Well, let's use this to find what that k, what that constant is. What number do I need to divide by 4 to get 12? So if we isolate and find this k, multiply both sides by 4, k here is going to equal 48. So my constant of variation, how do I get from x to my y, is 48. Well, let's read what the next sentence. Well, I know my constant of variation is 48. What is y when x equals 10? Well, let's go back to our inverse. If I know that these x and y are always inversely related, as the problem told me, I know that y equals k over x. And this time, I don't know y, but x is 10, right? So I'm going to plug in my k value of 48. So this is 48, right? I'm going to plug in 48. Divided by when x equals 10, which is here, right? So 10 is here. So I'm going to divide by 10. And I'm looking for y. So what is 48 divided? What is 48 divided by 10? It doesn't divide evenly, but let's see if we can. It's always good to simplify fractions. I can divide by 2, right? So if you divide by 2, we get 24 over 5, and nope, by 5's not even, 5's prime. That's as good as we're going to get. So y equals 24 over 5. Okay, so use the wording in the sentences here. Inversely means divide. Start with your basic variation. That okay, if it varies inversely, that means that y equals k over x. Plug in what you know, your x and your y, to find that constant that never changes. And because it's a constant, every time you're going to be plugging in 48 for that k value. So here y equals 24 over 5. So types of variation, 4 types. Direct, think multiply. Inversely, think divide. Joint means multiply 2 or more times. And then combined is when you're multiplying and dividing.